If you were MacArthur in 1942, watching the Pacific fall one island at a time, you would understand quickly that conventional warfare was not going to win this fight. What you needed were men willing to paddle a canoe into an enemy harbor, survive 400 days behind Japanese lines with nothing but a radio and the trust of local allies. Australia built every one of those capabilities from the ground up. I have researched every Australian Special Forces and Irregular warfare formation of the Second World War. Starting at the bottom, Lark Force. Private Bill Collins stood at Rabaul Harbour on the 23rd of January 1942, watching approximately 5,000 Japanese troops come ashore against a garrison of roughly 400. His post-war testimony described the defense as having no plan and no realistic expectation of survival. He was not wrong. Lark Force was a garrison formation, not a special operations unit. It opens this list because its collapse directly shaped everything that follows. General Horry's South Seas detachment overran Rabaul in fewer than 24 hours. The survivors who escaped into the jungle were ordered to fight as guerrillas, a mission they had not trained for, with equipment they did not have, on terrain they did not know. On the 2nd of February, Japanese forces herded approximately 160 prisoners to Toll Plantation and bayoneted them. The shock at Australian High Command was the beginning of something. The massacre forced a military establishment that had no special forces framework to build one, immediately, from nothing. Japanese Imperial Headquarters used the Rabaul conquest as a template in subsequent operation orders. The Toll Plantation massacre appeared in their own command records as consistent with standing orders. That is not a footnote, that is a policy. Next up, Gulf Force. Private Len Opie of the 2 over 21st Battalion arrived on Ambon Island in December 1941 with approximately 1,100 Australian and Dutch soldiers. When 10,000 Japanese troops landed on the 31st of January, OP later wrote that the outcome was settled within hours, not days. He survived 4 years of captivity. Roughly half of Gulf Force did not, overwhelmed in 4 days of fighting. At Laha Airfield following the surrender, Japanese forces executed between 300 and 400 prisoners in what became the Laha Massacre. Of approximately 500 Australians who survived to enter captivity, around 490 died through disease, malnutrition, and further killings. A survival rate below 20%, among the worst of any Allied unit in the entire Pacific theater. Vice Admiral Rokuzo Tamura, who ordered the Laha executions, was hanged in 1946. The court's finding was specific. The killings were not battlefield confusion, they were ordered policy. Moving on to the 1st Parachute Battalion. Corporal Richard Kelleher trained for parachute insertion at Tocumwal through 1943, expecting to jump into battle. On the 11th of September 1944, at Aitape in New Guinea, he charged the Japanese machine gun position single-handed to allow his section to withdraw, then went back into the fire for his wounded commander. He received the Victoria Cross. He never made a combat parachute jump. Australia's dedicated airborne force, raised in June 1943, found no viable large-scale airborne operation in the Pacific theater. The only significant jump made by battalion personnel was a supply drop into the Markham Valley, not a combat insertion. The battalion fought the remainder of the war as conventional jungle infantry and performed creditably. But Australia had built and trained a parachute capability. It had no campaign geometry to deploy. The specialized training was functionally wasted from the moment it was acquired. Japanese forces in New Guinea treated the battalion as standard infantry, because it had become standard infantry. No specific countermeasures were developed. The parachute capability was never identified as a distinct threat because it was never used as one, coming in the North Australia Observer Unit, universally known as the Necrus. Trooper Frank Clancy rode patrol routes through the Northern Territory for the better part of a year, covering coastlines and assessing potential landing sites. His patrol logs from 1942 record hundreds of kilometers covered, dozens of locations assessed, and 0 enemy contacts. He later described being told they were the first line of defense, which in practice meant they were the only line. Approximately 800 men on horseback and camelback provided the early warning coverage the Royal Australian Air Force could not maintain from altitude. Their reports fed into MacArthur's intelligence picture of Australia's northern approaches. The hard truth is that the Japanese never attempted the mainland landings the Nacroos were designed to detect. Their threat never materialized in the form anyone expected, which limits where any surveillance force without an enemy can sit on a ranking of operational impact. Post-war Japanese reconnaissance assessments over northern Australia rated the mounted patrol network as light screening force, negligible offensive capability. They were right, they were also never tested. We are leaving the disasters behind. What comes next actually worked with significant caveats. The Far Eastern Liaison Office. I need you to understand something about psychological warfare before we discuss this unit, because its record looks underwhelming and that assessment is partly unfair. Wing Commander Hamish Davidson, who commanded Philo, argued in post-war interviews that millions of dropped leaflets produced a cumulative effect on Japanese garrison morale that contributed to the speed of eventual collapse. He may have been right, he could not prove it, and the inability to prove psychological damage is the fundamental problem with evaluating every operation Philo ran. Established in 1942 to conduct propaganda operations across the Pacific, Philo produced materials in Japanese, Malay, and various island languages delivered by aircraft and agent networks. The volume was significant over 3 years of operations. The measurable results were limited, but measuring the results of psychological operations is inherently impossible by design. What can be said is that Philo was a serious capability applied to a serious problem, and the answer to how well it worked may simply be that nobody knows. Japanese military police issued standing orders to destroy Allied leaflets without reading them, and soldiers caught reading them faced punishment. The fact that they felt the need to issue that order tells you the material was circulating. Whether it was working is a question that went unanswered then and remains unanswered now. Up next, the Special Wireless Group. Sergeant Alan Rowan worked a radio intercept station in New Guinea in 1943, feeding signals traffic into the Allied decryption effort that supported ultra-intelligence. He never fired a shot. He also never knew during the war what his intercepts were being used for. The classification was absolute, and the work was invisible by design. The Special Wireless Group operated listening stations across Australia and the Pacific, collecting Japanese signals traffic for analysis and decryption. Its work fed directly into MacArthur's intelligence picture, convoy routing, force dispositions, air operation planning. The problem for this ranking is that the group's contributions are inseparable from the broader Ultra framework. It was a component of a system, not an independent operational actor. Its value was real and well documented. Its identity as a discrete special forces unit is the weakest on this list, which is why it sits here. Post-war debriefs of Japanese naval communications officers confirmed Allied signals intelligence had been more complete than we understood at the time. The Special Wireless Group helped produce that completeness invisibly, which was the point. The 2/5th Commando Squadron, Private James Machen described operations in the Aitape-Vevak area as fighting a war that headquarters kept forgetting about. In a documented contact in March 1945, a 12-man patrol from the unit maintained observation on a Japanese supply route for 11 days straight, moving only at night, before withdrawing with an intelligence report listing exact garrison positions along a 12-kilometer front. The 2/5th Commando Squadron evolved from the 2/5th Independent Company and conducted sustained patrol and reconnaissance operations against the Japanese 18th Army throughout the grueling Aitape-Vevak campaign of 1944 and 45. It was not a single decisive operation, it was months of grinding denial of enemy, freedom of movement in terrain that killed through disease before it killed through combat. The unit receives less public recognition than the Timor operations or the Singapore raid. That is a function of geography and timing, not capability. Japanese 18th Army operational records from the Aitape-Vevak period specifically noted that Allied patrol activity had significantly degraded the ability of garrison units to conduct resupply operations in the campaign's final year. The commando squadrons are not named by designation. The reference to their impact is unmistakable. Up next, the 2nd Commando Squadron. Here is what the official histories tend to smooth over about jungle warfare in New Guinea. Corporal Ted Calnan of the 2nd told the post-war interviewer that the worst enemy he faced was not the Japanese, it was scrub typhus. He had seen more men evacuated by stretcher with fever than with bullet wounds. He had also been in firefights at ranges measured in meters in jungle so thick he could lose visual contact with the man directly ahead of him. He described all of this without drama. That absence of drama was the psychological product of 2 years in the Pacific. The 2nd operated alongside the 2/5 in the Aitape-Vevak campaign with a specific intelligence role including prisoner of war snatches and long-range patrol penetrations against the Japanese perimeter in the war's final year. Its record is creditable and deserves more recognition than it receives. Japanese garrison records from the Vevak perimeter listed Allied commando patrols as a specific counterintelligence concern. Standing orders were issued to execute any Allied personnel captured in the operational zone. That is a formal threat assessment, not a routine precaution. Coming in, the 2/6th Cavalry Commando Regiment. Sergeant Peter Maguire of the 2/6th was on long-range patrol in the Bougainville interior in early 1945, operating against a Japanese garrison that numbered in the tens of thousands and had been strategically bypassed by the American advance. He wrote afterward that Bougainville was unlike his previous theaters because the enemy was not going anywhere and neither were the Australians, and everyone knew it. That mutual understanding produced a particular kind of sustained violence that the official histories have never fully conveyed. The 2/6th conducted the most sustained long-range patrol operations of any Australian unit on Bougainville from late 1944 through the war's end. The Bougainville campaign sits in the background of Pacific War history because it was, by American strategic design, a secondary theater. The garrison was isolated, bypassed, left to deteriorate, while MacArthur moved the main axis elsewhere. The Australians were given the residual task of keeping pressure on an enemy that was desperate, well-armed, and still capable of organized resistance. The 2/6th ran that mission without the attention or resources its difficulty warranted. Japanese 17th Army records on Bougainville showed Allied patrol activity had been factored into garrison dispositions from late 1944 onward. Specific orders were issued to maintain forward pickets against long-range infiltration. A formal acknowledgement that the 2/6th's reach into the interior had been noted and was being taken seriously. The 2/3rd Independent Company. Sergeant Bill Nemo received orders in late 1941 to deploy to Portuguese Timor as part of a preemptive occupation of neutral territory. He described the period between landing and the Japanese invasion as a strange kind of waiting in a place nobody wanted to fight in for something everyone knew was coming. The 2/3rd deployed alongside the 2,000 as part of Sparrow Force and contributed genuinely to the Timor guerrilla campaign. The distinction in ranking between the two companies is complicated. They operated in the same theater, under the same evolving command structure for much of the campaign. The 2/3 RD's operational record is solid and creditable. The documented impact differential between the two companies justifies their separate rankings on this list. Japanese garrison reports from mid-1942 noted the combined two-company guerrilla force as more effective than any equivalent Allied force encountered in the theater. The combined assessment is developed further when we reach the 2000. Moving on to the 2/1st Independent Company. This is the part most people get wrong about this unit. The 2/1st was not the most decorated or operationally significant of Australia's commando formations. It ranks where it does on this list because it was first. Formed in February 1941 under Lieutenant Colonel G.S. Bell, built on the model of British commando doctrine, trained in the kind of independent behind-the-lines operations no Australian military formation had attempted in the modern era. Everything you are about to hear, every unit above it on this list exists because someone built and ran the 2/1st first, proved the doctrine worked, and created the institutional memory from which all subsequent formations drew. The company deployed to Portuguese Timor, and its personnel later folded into the broader commando restructuring as the independent companies were redesignated squadrons. Its significance is foundational, not spectacular. It proved that Australians could be built into something the Australian military had no framework for in 1941. Post-war Japanese military assessments consistently expressed surprise at the speed with which Australia developed a viable special operations capability from nothing between 1941 and 1942. That development traces its beginning to the 2/1st. Now things start to get serious. Sparrow Force. Lieutenant Colonel William Leggett commanded the 2/40th Battalion, the core of Sparrow Force on Timor. On the 19th of February 1942, with Dili falling and the conventional defense collapsing, Leggett made a decision that almost no formally trained commander would have been prepared to make. He would not surrender. He would not attempt evacuation. He would take his remaining 400 men into the mountains, find food, find allies among the Timorese, and fight on. His signal to Australia that night was characteristically brief, still in the field. Sparrow Force conducted guerrilla operations on Timor for approximately 11 months, supplied by Royal Australian Navy vessels on night runs to the south coast. The operations foundation was the Timorese support network that Leggett's men built through relationship and demonstrated commitment rather than payment or coercion. At its peak, approximately 400 Australians kept a Japanese garrison fully occupied, a garrison that kept growing because 400 Australians refused to stop. The Timorese who supported them paid an enormous price after the Australians were evacuated. But we still have not reached the units that changed the course of entire campaigns. Japanese 48th Division records show the Timor garrison eventually totaled approximately 40,000 troops, deployed primarily to contain 400 Australians and their Timorese allies. That ratio is the most succinct evaluation Sparrow Force's operational significance has ever received. We are entering elite territory. These units did not just function, they changed the shape of campaigns and forced the enemy to change how they fought. Special units. Hold on to one specific detail before I give you the operational picture, because it explains something important about what special operations intelligence work actually required. Sergeant Christopher Turkettle was inserted by submarine onto the Borneo coast in late 1943 to establish contact with local intelligence networks and assess Japanese garrison strengths in the interior. His mission lasted 4 months. He operated on foot, living on local food, trusting people he had met days earlier with his life in territory where being identified meant execution without trial. The intelligence product he brought out was assessed by the Allied Intelligence Bureau as the most comprehensive picture of Japanese dispositions in British Borneo then available. That assessment came from the most capable intelligence organization in the Southwest Pacific Theater. It was not given casually. Special Unit was the maritime and island intelligence element of the AIB, conducting agent insertions and intelligence gathering operations across Borneo, the Celebes, and adjacent territories. Where Z Special Unit, which you are about to hear, conducted direct action raids, Special Unit's mission was to see, build networks, and report. Its product fed directly into air targeting decisions and into the planning for MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Less dramatic, arguably more persistently valuable across the breadth of the campaign. Post-war interrogation of Japanese counterintelligence officers in the Borneo area confirmed they had never successfully mapped Special Unit's agent network structure, despite devoting significant resources to the search. That failure to locate the network was the unit's greatest single operational achievement. The 2 Halcyon Independent Company. Corporal Jack Loveless kept a radio alive. Winnie the War Winner was a battered, improvised set that the company's signals team had maintained through the Timorese rainy season, through 2 relocations under enemy pressure, and through field conditions that would have ended most signals operations within weeks. In the early period of the Timor campaign, when Australian High Command had effectively listed the 2 Halcyon as destroyed, Winnie transmitted a message that reached Darwin with a simple and extraordinary implication. The company was alive, in the field, and requesting resupply. The documented reaction at headquarters was genuine shock. A unit that had been written off was asking for supplies. The two-halved independent company's Timor campaign is one of the genuine legends of Australian military history, acknowledged by military historians across multiple countries as a benchmark small unit irregular warfare operation. For more than 400 days, approximately 350 men conducted sustained guerrilla operations against a Japanese force that eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, built a support network among the Timorese through demonstrated commitment and shared sacrifice, and forced Tokyo to maintain a significant garrison on an island that had been expected to fall and go quiet. It did not fall quiet. The 2000 would not let it. Japanese 48th Division records described the company's operations as an obstacle to pacification disproportionate to the force involved. Tokyo's frustration was documented in official communications. The response, committing tens of thousands of troops to contain hundreds of Australians, was, in purely strategic terms, a miscalculation they never recovered from in that theater. The Allied Intelligence Bureau. When I went through the AIB's operational record for this video, what struck me was not any single achievement, it was the aggregation. Brigadier C.G. Roberts, who commanded the Bureau from its establishment in July 1942, did not command men who fired guns or paddled canoes into enemy harbors. He commanded the architecture that told those men where to go and why. Every unit from M Special to Z Special to the Coastwatchers to P and S Special units operated within the AIB framework. Roberts was not running a unit. He was running a system, and the system was the achievement. Established under MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command to consolidate all special operations, intelligence, and propaganda activities in the theater, the AIB at peak coordinated operations across Borneo, the Philippines, New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Singapore simultaneously. The intelligence it produced informed planning from tactical patrol operations all the way up to MacArthur's decision to bypass Rabaul and jump to Leyte. Without the AIB framework, Australia's special operations capability would have been a collection of capable but disconnected formations. The Bureau was the reason they were greater than the sum of their parts. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters maintained a specific file on the Allied Intelligence Bureau. Post-war examination of Japanese records confirmed that enemy intelligence estimated the AIB's operational reach as substantially larger than it actually was, devoting counterintelligence resources to neutralizing threats that did not exist in territories where the AIB had no active presence. The miscalculation was the Bureau's most consequential invisible achievement, the Service's Reconnaissance Department. Let me tell you what an SRD mission actually looked like, because the formal documentation sanitizes something that needs to be stated plainly. Major Rex Blow led Operation Agas into North Borneo in late 1944, inserting with a small team to assess Japanese garrison strengths and prepare intelligence for the liberation campaign. Every Japanese soldier in that territory had standing orders to execute any Allied operative captured in civilian dress as a spy, not as a prisoner of war. No Geneva Convention protections, no Red Cross notification, no possibility of survival if captured. Blow knew this precisely. He inserted anyway. His intelligence directly informed the planning for the Borneo landings at Tarakan and Labuan in 1945. Men who landed on those beaches because of his intelligence do not know his name. That anonymity was the nature of the work. The Service's Reconnaissance Department was the action arm of Australia's connection to the Special Operations Executive, ultimately becoming Special Operations Australia, operating Z Special Unit, M Special Unit, and a range of direct action and intelligence assets under the AIB framework. Its defining characteristic was not what it could do, it was what it asked of its people. Conventional soldiers captured by the enemy had theoretical protections under the laws of war. SRD operatives had none. Every man who inserted into enemy territory behind the lines understood that capture ended in execution, not imprisonment. The missions proceeded regardless. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters issued a formal directive in 1943 that Allied operatives found in civilian dress behind Japanese lines were to be executed without trial. The directive was a documented direct response to SRD operations. It is a formal acknowledgement in standing orders that the SRD had frightened Japanese command enough to require a change in how they handled the prisoners they found. And at number 2, I know some of you will push back on this, so stay with me until number 1 before you head to the comments. Number 2 is the Coastwatcher network, Ferdinand. On the 8th of August 1942, Lieutenant Paul Mason was positioned on a hilltop on Bougainville Island with a radio and a view of the sea. He counted 45 Japanese aircraft forming up and heading southeast toward Guadalcanal and Henderson Field, where the United States Marines had landed just 2 days earlier. Mason's signal reached Henderson Field with enough warning for American fighters to be airborne and in position before the strike arrived. The formation that should have destroyed Henderson Field was intercepted. Veterans of that engagement have stated directly that Mason's transmission was the reason they survived it. Commander Eric Felt ran the Ferdinand network from Townsville throughout the war. The network was built from pre-war residents, plantation managers, government officials, traders, missionaries who had stayed behind when the Japanese advanced, concealed their radios, and continued transmitting. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. Many had been commissioned specifically for this role and given a single operational instruction: stay, watch, and send. The risk was unconditional, and everyone involved understood it. Coastwatchers who were captured were executed. None of them were naive about this. What they produced in exchange for that risk was real-time intelligence on Japanese ship and aircraft movements, continuously updated from inside the enemy's own operating space, sustained across years of occupation in territory where every Japanese patrol was looking for them. Admiral Halsey stated after the war that the Coastwatchers saved Guadalcanal. Japanese Admiral Junichi Kusaka, who commanded air operations from Rabaul through the entire Guadalcanal campaign, said in post-war interview that his formations were always expected, that Allied forewarning was something he could not explain, could not neutralize, and could not overcome. He did not know about Paul Mason on Bougainville. He did not know about Jack Reed on New Ireland. He knew only that wherever his aircraft flew, someone was already watching. That is what a successful intelligence network looks like from the receiving end. But the absolute top of this list belongs to the Special Unit. On the night of the 26th of September 1943, Lieutenant Donald Davidson was sitting in a folding canvas kayak in the waters of Keppel Harbour, Singapore. Around him, in similar craft, were 5 other men. They had arrived in Singapore Harbour aboard a battered Japanese fishing vessel called Crite, sailed from Western Australia by 14 men under Major Ivan Lyon across 4,000 kilometers of Japanese-controlled ocean, navigating through waters where any challenge by a Japanese patrol vessel meant immediate death. Davidson's task that night was to paddle to a Japanese merchant vessel, place a limpet mine against its hull below the waterline, set a 7-hour fuse, and paddle away. He had already done this twice that evening at different ships. He would do it once more before returning to Crete and beginning the 4,000-kilometer voyage back to Western Australia. Operation Jaywick, conducted in September 1943, was the most successful maritime raid in Australian military history and one of the most successful special operations raids of the entire Pacific War. 14 men, 1 covert vessel, and 6 folding kayaks penetrated the most heavily defended harbour in the Japanese-controlled Pacific and sank or heavily damaged 7 vessels, totaling approximately 37,000 tons. Every man returned to Australia. The operation was, in the assessment of every historian who has examined it, operationally flawless. Do not let what I am about to tell you diminish what Jaywick achieved. In October 1944, Major Ivan Lyon led the second Operation Remo with 23 men, more advanced submarine support, and experimental submersible canoes. Operational security was compromised before the attack could be executed. Lyon himself died in a firefight on Sorek Island on the 16th of October 1944, fighting to give the surviving members of his team a chance to scatter and evade. 23 men went in. None came back. 10 were captured and held through the end of the war. They were executed by Japanese military tribunal on the 7th of July 1945, 39 days before Japan surrendered. The witness to Z Special Unit's legacy is not found in a single document or a single debrief. It is found in what Japanese Imperial Headquarters did after Jaywick, unable to explain how 7 ships in Singapore's harbour had been sunk, Japanese command did not consider the possibility that 14 men in a fishing boat had done it. Instead, they arrested and tortured more than 300 Chinese civilians in Singapore in what became known as the Double Tent Incident, convinced a local informant had enabled the attack. They stripped Crate's approach route from their maritime security assessments entirely, then had to reinstate it when they realized they still had no explanation. Japanese Naval Command immediately ordered a complete review and rewrite of harbor security protocols for every occupied port across Southeast Asia. The most powerful naval force in the Pacific had been made to doubt its own harbor security from the inside. They revised their standing orders across the entire theater in response to 14 men in kayaks. That order tells you exactly where Z Special Unit belongs on this list. What does this ranking reveal? Australia built a complete special operations architecture from nothing in less than 2 years, from the catastrophe at Rabaul in February 1942 to Z Special Unit paddling into Singapore Harbour in September 1943. Between the Coastwatcher network and Z Special Unit, which Australian Special Forces contribution do you consider more significant to the Allied victory in the Pacific? There is a legitimate case for both. Make yours.